Hey everybody, today is Monday, June 24th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from The Sympathizer, editor Vix Patel.
When the project was announced, I immediately reached out to HBO. I'm like, hey, what's going on with this project? I want to be in the mix for this. 20 minutes of the conversation was based around the project Snowpiercer, and he kept asking me questions about Snowpiercer. I was kind of a little confused initially, and then he goes, you know that I was exec producer on Snowpiercer, the pilot that I edited. And I said, I did not know that. That was the one thing from my resume that he was focused on, and we talked in length about that. Robert Downey Jr. is a wonderful, wonderful actor, and he does a lot of ad-libbing. And at times you question, is that Claude, or is that Professor Hammer, or is that actually just Robert Downey Jr. ad-libbing and kind of having too much fun with it? So you've got to question that.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, greetings, my fellow editing enthusiasts. Good to see you again. I hope your summer's off to a great start. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, well, bundle up, I guess. Winter is here. Today on the show, we get to catch up with a friend from a previous episode of the podcast. Editor Vix Patel is back on The Rough Cut, yeah. Last time he was here, we were talking about his incredible work on Ozark. Vix was nominated for an Oscar back in 2020 for that. Back in 2020, man, that feels like a million years ago. By the way, not for nothing, but next Wednesday, July 3rd, marks the 5th anniversary of the new edition of The Rough Cut. July 3rd, 2019. 250 episodes. What a ride. Podcast years are like dog years. I feel like I've been doing this for 35 years, not 5. But together we got to meet so many talented editors along the way, including Mr. Patel, and the project that has brought Vix back to the show today is called The Sympathizer. The Sympathizer, currently streaming on Max, is based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning book of the same name. It is both an espionage thriller and a cross-culture satire about the struggles of a half-French, half-Vietnamese communist spy during the final days of the Vietnam War and his new life as a refugee in Los Angeles, where he learns that his spying days aren't quite over. Like many of the projects we've covered here lately, it is a study in contrasting tones. And study it we will, under the tutelage of our guest lecturer Vix Patel. But before we start the class, please give me a minute of your time so I can school you on the best way to make your next film or TV show sound its very best. My friends, it is no secret who scholarly storytellers turn to when they need the very best in production audio. Why, of course, it's Extreme Music and their legendary roster of A-list musicians and composers, all gathered together to provide you with a vast catalog of top-shelf tracks. And they make it so easy to find the tracks that you're looking for using metadata like lyrics, tempo, genre, composer. You just type those words into their search engine. Better than that, you can even show Extreme Music what you need by uploading a reference track so they can find you other ones just like it. You can choose from different track lengths, you can customize the instrumentation, you can get the licensing done right there on their website, or get a little help from one of their reps at an office near you. It is absolutely free to try, and I think a lot of fun to do. So the next time you have a movie or TV show to make it with great production audio from Extreme Music. Okay, we have a podcast to make. Luckily, we have a great editor on hand to lead the way. From The Sympathizer, here's editor Vix Patel. Maybe this would be part of the process of just sort of easing yourself back in, talking about it.
Sure. Let's see what questions you have. Maybe that will entice me.
All right. Well, let's see what kind of questions I have for you. You know, I usually start off talking about how an editor got the job on the project, and we will, but I thought I'd put a little twist on that and start by talking about what interested you in taking it, whether it was the material or who you'd be working with, some kind of aspect to it that was a new challenge for you, or all the above.
Well, pretty easy answer on that one, and it was director Park Chan-wook. I mean, for me, when the project was announced, I believe in 2001, I immediately reached out to HBO. I'm like, and I've got a relationship with Jenna at HBO, and I reached out to Jenna. I said, hey, what's going on with this project? I want to be in the mix for this. And she introduced me to Jack Schuster, who was the post-exec. And he's like, we're in the works, but I'm glad that you're interested, blah, blah, blah. And Jack and I hit it off, and I was always front and center there. And, you know, then he pitched me to the producers and the showrunner and then to director Park. But it was definitely director Park, and I'm a big fan of his works, specifically Old Boy, which I just loved. He made that movie 20 years ago, and it stuck with me. So all director Park initially.
when you talk to him, do you find it's a good practice to really know that director's resume to be able to build a relationship about this new project that you're going to be doing together?
I mean, I was prepared, but we didn't have that conversation. We spoke for about 50 minutes, and it was really interesting. He asked a lot of questions via his translator, but then 20 minutes of the conversation was based around the project Snowpiercer, and he kept asking me questions about Snowpiercer. I was kind of a little confused initially, and then he goes, "You know that I was exec producer on Snowpiercer, the pilot that I edited with Scott Derrickson." And I said, "I did not know that." So we talked about that, and he's asking what happened, etc. So we just got on in a different way, and that was the one thing from my resume that he was focused on, and we talked in length about that. And then we just talked about not your typical questions that come from a director, but we talked about the project. We talked about what excited me about the project, the scripts, the first two scripts. He talked about his vision a little bit. We talked about music. We talked about how I work and and then my philosophy on working with a director, the partnership that comes from that. So it was a really fruitful conversation. And 20 minutes after my conversation, HBO calls and tells me that director part wants to work with me.
Wow.
It was amazing.
That's got to be a hell of an interview. You get the call 20 minutes later.
Yeah, it was pretty special. It was pretty fun, yeah.
Well, the reason I asked you about researching his previous work, does that director ask you about things you've done in the past? And I was going to go to Ozark, but then you brought up Snowpiercer. Did he ask you at all about Ozark?
He did not. He asked me what I was just wrapping up. And that was another thing that he was excited by, which I was doing a recut for Paramount. And it involved the actor Michael Shannon, who he had worked with. So he was just, oh, check. I've worked with Michael Shannon. He's great. And, he did Snowpiercer. So it's like connecting the dots in that way. But he did not ask me about Ozark. Snowpiercer was the project because he was involved with Snowpiercer. And, he asked me how I like to work, etc.
What is he really asking when he says, "Vix, how do you like to work?"
Now, after the fact, I think he's kind of asking, am I a pair of hands, or am I somebody who's gonna bring something to the table? He wants your opinion. He wants your ideas. He does not just want a pair of hands, which is great because that's not what I am. I try to contribute and I try to elevate the script, the filmmaking, directing, etc., etc. So it was good that he asked that question. And I said, as I said to him, Director Park, I said, I'm going to offer you a point of view. I'm going to be very mindful and respectful of the material, but I'm not just going to assemble this for you. And then we talked in, length about his process and how he storyboards and stuff, etc. And then we talked a lot about music and what he was thinking tonally, even in terms of needle drops and temp score, which was really fascinating and interesting, his take on it. And then we talked, as I said earlier, we talked about partnership. I think, I said to him, if I was to get the job, then I hope you would look at me as a partner in this project. And on the flip side now, I truly hope that's what he thinks of me. I was a solid partner for him, after 18 months of collaboration with him. So,
well, as part of the research process or the preparation process, The Sympathizer is based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel of the same name. Did you read the book?
I did not. I don't. For me, the blueprint is the script. So for me, I deliberately didn't read the novel. One day maybe I will, but. I elected not to read the novel because I don't know what the novel gets me. I think I've circled around other projects which are based off adaptations from novels, etc. I always choose not to because for me it's the script. That's what I have to focus on, and that's what I'm trying to elevate. That's the blueprint for me.
Any references of other films? There's one episode you can't help but think about Tropic Thunder, which I think you guys kind of have a little fun with. But any references that you discussed going into the showrunner in terms of style or your approach to putting the show together?
There wasn't. I was kind of optimistic that Director Park would have said to me, hey, Vix, go watch this, go watch that. But he did not. The thing that we did talk about a little bit was music and the 70s music. And then we talked about temp score, and he was really... he asked me to think and listen to score by Lalo Schifrin, and that 70s kind of espionage, score with like Get Carter, etc., was a good example. Roy Budd, who did Get Carter, and then 70s music specifically, because that was the whole project's obviously set in the 70s. So, but no visual references. The thing that he said to me was like, whenever there's humor, let's try pull out as much humor as possible, like cut for comedy when possible. And his aesthetic was, I love to be in the white. That's my thing, you know. And there you go. So you keep all those things floating around in your brain as you're working, and you have at it. And the thing with Director Park's process is, and I didn't realize this until I was doing the actual pilot, because episode 2 was the first episode I actually edited of his, because that's the episodes 2 and 3 were the first episodes that he was shooting. And his process is every day he sends all the departments a short list of what, for each scene. So if there's 3 scenes, he's got his shot list for each scene, and he knows where he wants to start, where and the structure of where he wants it to be. However, I never received those for the first episode, so I just did my thing, which was actually really good, because I put it together just reacting to the film and watching the dailies. I'm like, okay, I think this is where he wants to start. This is where I want to start, etc. And I put it together, and he was pretty happy with that. And I said to him, afterwards when we did the pilot, and I started receiving those shot lists, I'm like, I never got this for the first episode, and it's good and bad, because it's interesting when you have a document like that. You sometimes you don't trust your gut, because you're like, I know he wants to start here, or I know he wants to build the scene potentially this way, but my instinct is telling me this, and I'm reacting to the film, and I should put it together this way. So even though he sent those, it was only just a 1-page little document. I actually kind of put it to the side, and I would just build the scene the way I felt like it should be built, and then I would look, and I'm like, okay, I've got it pretty good,
So we have a lot of story things to tear into. Before we do, I thought we'd clear up some of the nuts and bolts aspect of the job. Mm-hmm. Filming took place in L.A. and Thailand. Where were you cutting?
In L.A. So filming took place completely. Episodes 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 were all L.A. And then the pilot and episode 7 was shot in Thailand. And all of post was LA, and then remotely we worked with Director Park from Korea from the tail end of April of 2022 till the middle of January was all remote from South Korea. I had a system at home, and then we would port into the system at the office. And I had 2 wonderful assistants, Victoria Lang and Julian Doan, and pretty seamless, truthfully. The challenge was the evening sessions and working remotely, just because of the time difference. But in terms of technical stuff, everything worked flawlessly.
In terms of your colleagues, you were working with 2 other editors on the series. Mm-hmm. I think it was Jin Lee and Fernando Stutz. Mm-hmm. What is the process of just joining a show and getting to know the team?
I never actually spoke with Fernando the entire process. He was, his episode was episode 4 with director Fernando Morales, and he was in Brazil. So he worked remotely from Brazil.
And that's kind of the Tropic Thunder episode, as I call it.
Correct. It's the episode that's, it's a bottle episode. It's, it's the movie within a movie. And then Jin and I spoke, initially we spoke a lot, because she was editing episode 3, I was editing episode 2, and we were discussing, from score to aesthetic and just talking about performance, etc. Because it was all coming in, it was all new. If I learned new information from Director Park or vice versa, we would share that intel, because he was shooting on the lot, and we kind of would spend a day or 2 on the lot. But then after principal photography wrapped, we were 2 ships passing in the night. We just weren't able to connect, because I would potentially start my day anywhere between 4 and 5 p.m. and work till anywhere between 10 and 1 a.m. basically, because I was on Korea time. And she would be working during the day with the other showrunner So by the time I'm walking into the office, she's kind of leaving, and that's how it just ended up being for months and months and months.
You would think that would be pretty challenging, not seeing everybody else's cuts when you're working on things.
It was challenging. It was definitely challenging because typically when you're on a series, you build a rapport with your peers and your co-editors, and there's a conversation. Even if it's sometimes brief, there's still a conversation. But this one, we just didn't. I mean, we just didn't, we couldn't find the time to do that, and we communicate via our assistants, etc. And Jin's assistant was an old assistant of mine, Michael Board. So there was communication, but it just wasn't. We were never in the same space that often together, which was a challenge because by the time I would roll into the office, I'd also work during the day to execute Director Park's notes from the previous evening. So I'd work, let's say I work till midnight, then I come home, go to bed, wake up, get my day going, then do some work at home, and then come back into the office. So we were up against it. We really were up against it. And that's how it was for a lot of that. Because even with Mark Munden's episode 5 for myself, he didn't come to LA. He was in England. So then the time difference of working, it was challenging and grateful for technology. I mean, truly, if this was pre-COVID, I don't know how we would have done that. I mean, everybody would have just had to have been here. Or Jin and I would have had to have been flown to Korea to work on the project with Director Park. Truthfully, I wish we could have all just connected and been in the same space throughout the entire process, but we couldn't. And there was an element of a challenge with Director Park being in Korea. Also, myself having to work with a translator, even though Director Park, he's pretty good with his English. He just elects not to speak back in English. Jin didn't have that challenge because she's Korean and she can communicate directly. So it's a two-step process for myself. But I wish we were all just in the same space throughout the whole project.
Since you brought up some language differences, a lot of the dialogue in the show is delivered in Vietnamese. So you're going to be working quite a bit with subtitles. They posted the script from episode 1, Death Wish, online. It was really fascinating because you get to see, even in the script, they have Vietnamese on the left, English on the right for you to work with. Mm-hmm. When I was talking to the Shogun editors, they said they had the subtitles actually burned into the dailies to work with.
Yes, we didn't have that, but we had it pretty early on. So the way we did it was we would get wonderful notes from set, from our consultants on set. And then Julian Dome, our assistant, he's Vietnamese. So you've seen the script. So we would have a good translation. So I would do the rudimentary version of the scene with the Vietnamese, not knowing a word, but just kind of listening to it and kind of trying to match it. I'd build the blocks of it. And then I would share that version of the scene with Julian, and Julian would subtitle it for me. And then he would be like, oh, Vic, you need to look at this word or tweak this area, but you're in the ballpark, etc. And I'm like, great. And then I would craft the scene once I had all the subtitles on screen. Then I would really go in there and craft it for performance, reactions, takes, etc. And that was my process of how to do it. That's how I did it. And then Julian, I think he scripted all the Vietnamese scenes. I think he used Scripter, and I think he scripted it, I believe. My process was different than, I think, Jin's, which was I would just literally cut the scene together with what I thought was being said, and then I would share that with him, and then he would help subtitle it for me.
So as part of that process, knowing that your audience is going to be spending some time reading the subtitles, does that have any influence on the timing of the cuts? Do you want to let something rest a little longer just to know that the audience has had time to clock what's happening?
For me, it is 100%. I don't like when subtitles go over a cut. I mean, it happens, and it even happens in Sympathizer. We do it, but very little in my episodes. If you watch my episodes, I try to just play the subtitle actually on that one shot, because I think it's a lot for the viewer to take in. Read, and then taking the visual image. But then if the image changes whilst they're trying to read as well, then it's just, there's just so much going on for your eye. So I try to make sure that I stay on a shot long enough that you're able to read the entire subtitle. And that affects the rhythm of the episode, if you think about it. It really does. Maybe the episode's not as paced paced quickly as it maybe should be, or vice versa. But I don't know. When I watch it back, I'm like, okay, great. I read it and I saw the images, and I'm following along, and the story's playing. So that's my instinct, and that was my instinct actually, even on the moments in any other series that I've worked on, where even in Jack Ryan, there was a bunch of subtitles in Jack Ryan season 1. Ozark, we had a bunch of subtitles in some of the scenes in the last 2 seasons of Ozark. Same philosophy.
This show can be very funny and can be very dark, even within the microcosm of a single episode. The first episode, Death Wish.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of comedy to be found early on, but ends in a tragic moment. Just balancing that. I know he says, hey, cut for comedy whenever you can, but you know you're going to end up in a place that gives you quite a turn at the end. What was your approach in terms of how dark or how light you wanted to calibrate the show?
It's a really good question. And I think there are moments where the comedy is baked in via a character and a moment in a scene. But if it feels too hokey, then, your radar kind of goes up. Robert Downey Jr. is a wonderful, wonderful actor, and he does a lot of ad-libbing. And at times you question, is that Claude, or is that Professor Hammer, or is that actually just Robert Downey Jr. ad-libbing and kind of having too much fun with it? So you got to question that. Because if you kind of let an actor like that just do their thing, it could be wonderful and it could be really funny, but then it derails the scene. Like, as you said, it's a delicate dance between the comedy and keeping it serious, and also just telling the story the way it was meant to be told. So it's a challenge. But as Director Park said to me, he goes, Vic, just find the comedy. If there's anything that plays funny, first just play it. Let's play it. And we can always tone it back. And that's what happened. So there'll be moments and scenes which would make me laugh out loud. And I'm like, well, I have to build the scene around that. And there are times when Director Pat will watch and he's like, I think it's too much. Let's either take that out or let's find a different take and tone it down.
Well, I have one of those makes you laugh out loud scenes to talk about with you, Vix, that you cut.
Mm-hmm.
It is the scene towards the end of episode 1 where the captain, Bon, and Mon are having a drink and they're talking about, well, Saigon's about to fall and what will happen to us next. And they're getting drunk. And Bond gets into a fight with some soldiers and it takes place in the background. So what you end up with basically is kind of a scene like from Airplane or The Naked Gun where there's a serious conversation going on in the foreground and in the background is this crazy, funny fight that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this choreographed thing going on in the background, but you also have a different scene in a sense playing out in the front.
That's right. And you found the scene, which is probably one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, actually, that beer garden night scene. Because it's quintessentially Director Park, the background. Like that, the way he framed that, the story's being told here. You and I having this deep and meaningful conversation, just like the captain and Mun. But in the background, there's so much fun going on. And you're distracted in a good way, but then you also have to pay attention to what's happening in the front. So it's choosing when to pop out to the wide for that comedic relief, but when once you're in there, you kind of have to stay in there. So majority of that scene is actually my editor's cut of that sequence. It changed and it kind of came back again, and I'm kind of grateful for that, because once we're in there, the conversation does get really serious, and then he's being told to go and follow the general and go to America, and the emotion there that's played by the captain, you really can't cut out. You just, you can play the front end of that scene a little bit looser, but once you get in there, you really just have to stay in there between him and Mun, basically. But then right at the end, the last cut of that scene is you pop out to that 2-shot, and then Bond gets tackled, and then we cut to the next scenes. But I always do this. I just trust my instinct. I trust my instinct. I try to stay out as wide as possible when it's working, but when the story gets real and once we need to be intimate, we're in there.
Something else you do, and it's generally played for comedy, is sort of a rewind thing that you do. So somebody says something and the captain will be like, wait, what happened? And then you'll sort of do a rewind of the footage and play it out again. How did that come about?
Yeah, it was always baked into the script of like the image just rewinds. But conceptually, there was no specific idea. So I just kind of ran with that. Initially, I did the rewind with freeze frames. Director Pat goes, no, let's do it with moving images. So I did the rewind with moving images. I played around with different options there. But each rewind is different in itself, because some of them are 4-frame images that rewind. Some of them are much faster when they rewind. Some of them much slower. But it was a great device to help you understand that the captain's forced confession, there are mistakes in his forced confession. He often forgets, and it was a way for us to utilize that and kind of showcase that. As his memory would be like, oh yeah, I forgot that. I'm sorry, let me take you back and then let me start here. So visually it was stunning to do, because if you watch it and if you were to freeze it, it's little clues of what's coming or what we've just seen previously.
How about just setting up the story itself, setting up the captain? I mean, he's a double agent.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of work that goes on there to educate the audience as to what's going to happen over the rest of the series. How much of that did you have to rework or move around just to make it fit?
A lot of work went into that. Not so much moving it around. You know, the forced confession that he has in the opening helps ground you with his internal monologue and his voiceover saying, I think the first lines are, I'm a spy, I'm a spook, I'm a sleeper, I'm a man of two faces. So that helps you hook into him and gives you access to the captain, because it's the first image we see of our protagonist. And it's all in the details. So sometimes it's too subtle, so we had to just kind of spell it out a little bit, meaning when we introduced Claude, that was his CIA agent, and then the general, who's the South Vietnamese general. So it's like, and he's stuck right in between them. So if you're paying attention, you know that this guy is working for both sides. So there are times that we had to spell it out, but hopefully as you get into the series, you kind of trust it and you understand it, because I think it's very true to the script. The first 15 pages are extremely dense, and you are thrown into the deep end. And that's kind of what happens in the series. You're still thrown into the deep end. It's a little bit different than what was on the page, but you're playing catch up, which I love, because if you trust it, you will catch up. And the images do that, and the rewind stuff does that, and you come back to the movie theater, and then you're off to the races. So it commands the audience's attention, and it asks the audience just to trust us. We're confident in our filmmaking here. We're going to guide you to the end.
You mentioned the voiceover. Is that something that you had to rework a lot, or is that always pretty much as scripted, or things you would go back and say, you know what, those details I need to put in there just aren't coming through. Let's do some voiceover that wasn't there from the beginning?
Correct, yes. It wasn't so much reworked. It was always evolving, because the voiceover could be whatever it needs to be. It's just, how do we utilize the voiceover to make it feel internal, to make it feel what the captain's thinking? If he's not giving us something, and how do we move the story forward? So it was constantly evolving. I hope it doesn't feel like exposition. I hope it's not telling you what you should be feeling. Hopefully it was additive. And I think it is. And I think Don and Director Pat did a really good job of writing that.
Yeah, voiceover is a funny thing to talk about. There are times when I think people worry that we have to use this because we didn't get something else right in the story. And I didn't get that sense here. And I wonder if maybe something that really helped was the conceit of the fact that he's giving a confession. And that just sort of lends itself to, well, of course he's doing the voiceover. He's writing the story in his head for us. Mm-hmm. Without that conceit, do you think you may have felt differently about the voiceover element?
That's a really interesting question as well. I don't know how to answer that one. That's a.
I wasn't sure how to ask it, to be honest, because in the end it does work.
Yes.
But I know voiceover can be a point of contention for editors sometimes. Like, it's something I regret having to do, and other times, like, it fits, it worked.
Yeah, I think less is more. We definitely, I will say definitely, our radar would go up anytime we would either get asked to add more voiceover from whoever, the producers or the HBO, etc. We would be like, well, we don't need that. We just do not need that. We don't want to keep going to that bag of tricks. It's not really additive. It wasn't really helping, and it's like going back to the re-education camp. We don't want to just keep cutting to the re-education camp. All he's doing in the re-education camp in his little space is writing the confession. So we don't want to just pop back there. So again, we have to be very, very smart about when we revisit those pieces. And in the pilot, we set it up at the opening and we set it up at the end. And the one at the end for me is so impactful. Coming off the tarmac and then cutting directly to his face, teary-eyed, he's remembering what we've just witnessed. And that is such an emotional beat. And then he hears the Del Shannon song at the end, which was pretty cool, So I'm sorry, Matt, I'm not sure how to really fully answer that question because it's a tricky one, and it was something we toyed with a lot for sure.
It is a tricky one, and I never ask it because I know it can be a little touchy, and you were very game to even try. And I would not have asked it had I felt that the voiceover didn't work in the series, and it does.
Mm-hmm.
And another reason I'm glad that I asked is because as part of your answer, you teed up something I also really want to talk about, and that is the end of episode 1, Death Wish. They're trying to escape Saigon before the actual fall happens.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very dramatic ending.
Mm-hmm.
The captain is with the South Vietnamese that are escaping to America, and his friend Bond loses his wife and newborn child. It's a very dramatic scene and a lot going on visually. I mean, it's a big set piece also that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could talk a little bit about the tension and the drama of it, but also with the backdrop of all the VFX work that had to be done and how that affected your cut.
Yes, very challenging sequence. I was part of that sequence from basically working with animatics from about November of 2022. The moment I came onto the project, Director Park, myself, Chad Wanstreet, who's our VFX supervisor, and Ji Young, the cinematographer, we were building this animatic out because we knew it was going to take X amount of days to film this sequence. So with the help of some temp images from Chad, we put together the sequence and presented that to Director Park and, off Director Park's storyboards, etc. And it constantly evolved. And then we had the sequence. We were like, okay, this is what Director Park's going to go off to Thailand and he's going to shoot it. And I believe they shot it for 4.5 days, that whole sequence. Initially, for me, I had that animatic, which I was part of creating with Julian Doe, my assistant, and we built that. I kind of like, okay, well, this is this beat, but where's this? And, they elected to not shoot that whilst they're out there. And then it was initially, my first conversation was with Chad, where I'm like, okay, so I think I've got the pieces in the correct place. I think this is what's going to happen in this shot, etc. And he's like, and he would clarify and he'd be like, yes, this is what's happening here. And then we would temp in some crude animation just to help tell the story. And for example, when the bus flips over, I'd asked Julian just to temp that in for me. So he drew a crude bus with, a smiley face and we had it tip over. So those little pieces helped with timing for myself in terms of rhythm for the cut. So I knew what was happening here in this shot because the shot's just empty. It's just a tarmac and the camera move does that. So we put a temp bus in there. He put 10 explosions in there, etc. We filled it with sound and music, and then it evolved. It obviously, it was one of the sequences actually we locked very quickly because there was so much VFX work that needed to happen. Once we were in a place where we were happy with the sequence, Director Park and I wouldn't say we spent that long working on that sequence. We probably, a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, we got it into the place where we wanted it. And then we involved Chad and we had him pulling all the shots and started working on VFX. Once VFX came in, then we would make a few adjustments, etc. But it pretty much stayed the way we had imagined it.
Well, the other half of that work is the sound. You've got the rockets and explosions and the screaming and the wall of the people running around in the background. For something like that, do you turn to your assistant and say, see what you can do with the sound design for this scene?
Yes. Initially, I let Julian kind of run with it, and he did a fantastic job of it. But the one thing that we both talked about in length was we have to keep the baby alive. If you keep the baby alive, and then all of a sudden the sound of the baby crying goes away, it's pretty horrific. That's pretty haunting. So there's a moment, where there's an explosion happens in the foreground and the camera dollies into our heroes, but specifically with Lynn and Baby Duke, and then you hear the baby piercing cry and they run to the bunker. It's so impactful to hear, to go through that process, and you've got this sound which you're familiar with, which is the baby crying, and then all of a sudden the absence of that is pretty horrific. So that was the temp design. Julian did all fantastic work with the explosions and the rockets and all the gunfire and the helicopter crash, etc., and creating that whirling effect, all on a temp basis. And then when we were on the stage, We mixed that sequence, I want to say at least probably three. We probably spent about 3 days total, maybe 2.5, 3 days total of just working on that sequence. And Danielle and Mark, our mixers, did a stellar job of that. And Tim Kimmel did a stellar job of building that. And we had multiple passes on that sequence because we had passes before VFX came in. And then once we had pretty much an entire day, I feel like once all the VFX came in, then it's augmenting that and remixing it. So yeah, and then you gotta pick, right? You have to pick. You can't have music driving and sound effects driving at the same time because then you just got mush. It's you gotta pick your moments, and it's and I think Mark and Danielle did a wonderful job of mixing that. To hear that on the big screen, you needed a break. I mean, yeah, ears would be piercing because you wanted that to land and you wanted that to be at a certain level, specifically emotionally and dramatically, but then also once you ramp that sound up to that cut to the captain in the re-education camp, it should give you that feeling and that effect of, oh my God, that was his memory and that's what we just witnessed. As harrowing as it is for us as a viewer, it's also harrowing for him because his friend's wife was killed and his godson was killed as well. And you see that look in his face. And I truly found that cut really, really powerful.
I've done my best to hold off on asking you this because you brought it up a few times, but I said, no, I'm going to wait. The needle drops. So how did the needle drop process work once it came time to get in the editing room? Was it something where you had a playlist to work with or you just tested a bunch of different things?
Yes. Throughout the process, there was definitely opportunities for needle drops. There's obviously the 70s Vietnamese needle drops as well. Don had an extensive playlist that he would share with us. And then we would just listen and, pull up Spotify and find stuff that I think could work. And we played around with a lot of different needle drops. The interesting thing, which is actually scored now, was the opening of episode 2. The amount of versions that we went through for the opening of episode 2 with needle drops, and then at the end we decided to score it was really interesting, and I think it's more powerful without the needle drop.
When you're swapping out a needle drop for score, do you even go through the temp score process, or do you just go right to the composer and say, well, these are the needle drops we were considering?
I think Director Park just had him score it independently. The opening of episode 2, it's tricky to play a needle drop through the whole thing. I don't know how much justice it does for the entire sequence. It works for certain parts of the sequence, but then as a whole, it doesn't really work. So it was stronger to play it, drive for a beat, then score it, and then discover that the captain is listening to a song on his road trip. And I'm glad. I really like that piece of score for that sequence. I think it's stronger with score rather than the needle drop.
Well, tell me about the kind of footage you were getting back from the two different directors you worked with in terms of coverage, amount of takes they would do. You mentioned, with Robert Downey Jr., he might be inclined to do some improv, but I would think in a show like this, there would probably be very little room for improv. Regardless, tell me about the kind of footage you got back and also how many cameras were you working with?
Mainly, I would say 2 cameras, but Director Park is mainly, a single camera kind of guy. His Director Park's filmmaking and directing it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Like the pieces, they all go together. It's really interesting. It's like he'll run, a setup and you watch the dailies, you're like, okay, this setup is specifically for these lines of dialogue. And then you're going to go from this to this other setup because he's covered it specifically for that section. It's really interesting. Mark is another wonderful director, but Mark would say cover the entire scene in all the setups, whereas Director Park wouldn't do that. Like it's very, very, it's a jigsaw puzzle with Director Park. So that's the difference, I would say. So yes, Director Park, I believe, would allow Robert to, the earlier takes, he would just allow him to do as much kind of ad-libbing as he would, but then he would corral him and be like, no, let's lose some of these ad-libs, then let's just stay true to the script. And in editorial, we would play with that. Like some of the ad-libs would stay, but again, I think you got to keep it all on the tracks. And I think sometimes When the ad libs take you out and make you laugh when you're not supposed to be laughing, I think that's when it's a disservice to the scenes.
Mr. Downey was an exec producer on the series, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Did he come into the cutting room at all and offer any sort of perspective or notes?
He did not come into the cutting room. He did offer notes. They were all actually wonderful notes. Super, super smart, very in tune with his character, very in tune with the series, definitely acutely aware of performance, not just from himself, but from the other actors too. So really wonderful thoughts from Robert, actually. But, you know, Susan, his wife, and then Amanda Burrell from Team Downey, they would offer their thoughts.
So we've talked about a few scenes, and one of those scenes we talked about might be the answer to this question, but do you have a favorite scene from the series that you cut?
We've talked about two of the scenes, which are two of my favorite scenes, which is the beer garden at night sequence, the challenge of that sequence, which is you've got so much fun and comedy happening in the background, but you've got this intimate, really powerful conversation that's happening in the foreground, when to be present in the foreground and when to step out. And then obviously the tarmac sequence at the end. I mean, the challenge of just doing a sequence like that, making it feel as if you're immersed in that scene with the captain and in the captain's point of view, utilizing every tool we have, from the visual tools around us, using sound, the way it was mixed. Pretty proud of that sequence. I think it was a fun sequence to work on. Obviously, extremely tragic. And I hope it had the emotional weight that it deserved.
Well, I can certainly understand why that is what you chose. There is another scene that you cut that I could not help but watch and smile and think of you cutting this scene, because it's in episode 5. After the movie within the movie happens, the captain goes to see the director of that movie within the movie, and they had a bit of a falling out at the end of the movie. And the captain says to the director, just promise me that you're going to leave in the dialogue, the Vietnamese dialogue, as I intended it to be in. And Robert Downey Jr. goes on this great tangent about, well, that's just the sacred mystery of the editing process. I can't predict the journey. Editing isn't about clarifying the story or hammering home the theme. It's about rhythm and impulse and sex and jazz.
And jazz, yeah.
How much fun could that be for an editor to cut that scene where Robert Downey Jr. is going on about what editing is?
It was so much fun. And talk about ad-lib, right? At the end, Robert miming the instruments. I mean, when I watched Dailies for the first time, I fell out of my chair because it was so funny the way he did it. Robert's fantastic. Again, a delicate dance of when to use his improv and ad-libs and when not to. But that was a scene where you're like, that's just brilliant. He gave 3 or 4 different versions of that trumpet playing or instrument playing at the end, and brilliant. But yes, that was a fun sequence to edit, fun scene to edit. Another scene that I actually really enjoyed editing was when he's in the hospital with the lawyer and Violet, the auteur's assistant. To me, that scene's really funny too, because both those two other actors played it so well, and the captain doesn't really do much. He's just laying there with his bouquet of flowers on his chest, basically. And I think Mark did a really wonderful job of directing that sequence too.
The whole series is great. You did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for helping us unravel the sacred mystery of the editing process today. The only thing else I have to say to you is, after seeing what the captain did with that squid, please tell me they didn't serve calamari at the wrap party.
They did. No, I don't know, actually. Maybe they did.
What is more fun than editing a show or movie that has a fun scene about editing? A scene that describes editing as the sacred mystery of the editing process. And that is why we do this every week, to get to the bottom of that mystery. So good to have Vix back on the show. He's always fun and insightful, and I'm grateful he could make some time for us. Thank you, Vix. You did a great job on The Sympathizer, and I hope you have a great summer. I hope you all have a great summer, in fact. You work hard. We all work hard. You need time to relax and recharge. But you can also use the time off to learn a few new tricks that can help you when you do get back to work. And that starts with getting up to speed on all the latest with Avid Media Composer. You know what? Scratch that. Don't worry about the latest. Focus on all the greatest there is to learn in Avid Media Composer. An editing system that has been defined and refined by editors all over the world for 30 plus years. You should be one of those editors, and you can. Just click that link in the show notes and it will take you over to avid.com, where you can begin or continue your journey to editorial greatness. Now then, show's over. That should be obvious. But what about next week? Is there a show next week or even the week after? Not sure. If there is a show next week, it will probably be on July 3rd, just to keep things fun with the whole 5th anniversary bit. But I'm still figuring all that out right now, so I might see you next week or I might not. And I might see you the week after or I might not. But one way or the other, we will get back together again and continue our little adventure in post-production. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.